Thank you so much. Thank you. It's such an honor to be here. And I know many of you got the podcast that I did with Carrie that's actually coming out today. So we're both excited about that. But I wanted to talk to you about some of the information that we didn't get to, because I've been to conferences like this, like you are, and I like to take away practical things. So I wanted to give you some of the important items to move this topic along in your churches. But telling you a little bit about why I started getting involved in this topic. I have been a female all of my life, actually, and I've been in ministry, leading in ministry most of my life, but I haven't always been someone who has really looked at the role of women in leadership or felt like it was a big banner I wanted to wave. And part of that is because as a minority in leadership circles, I felt very awkward about it. Maybe some of the other women in the room can relate to that, or other minorities. When you are one of the only one, and you know that little Sesame Street song that one of these things is not like the other kind of rings in your head whenever you walk into a room, it can be very awkward. And I didn't want to be sort of known as someone with an agenda or someone who was trying to fight for something. I honestly was just so glad to be able to serve my church. And I have been serving 20 years at a couple really pretty big multi-site churches, and mostly rode the waves of a couple of them as we grew and took on that whole world. And so as I start doing more consulting now with multi-site churches and leadership development, I find myself in a lot more spaces like this, networking events, conferences, and usually there's a few women in the room, and we kind of will get together or find each other on social media or have coffee before to try to sort of build some friendships and networks. And that's the way it's been for me for the last 20 years. But just over a year ago, things started to shift. The conversation about women was kind of beginning to shift. It was actually before the Me Too movement and all of that hit, but I had some really odd experiences that stood out for me. I had a team of senior and executive pastors in a conference similar to this come and ask to have developing the women on their team. So I thought they were awesome. We sat and had a great, very interesting for me to see how they were approaching things. But then a couple weeks later, I was at another conference of male leaders do the exact same thing. And then following 6 weeks later, I had a do the same thing. And you know what it's like when all of a sudden you have three weird things happen kind of in a row. You realize God might be trying to tell you something. And so I started actually pausing and just saying, gosh, this is so fascinating that these male leadership teams that they were from very different cultures in our country, very different theological viewpoints on the topic, which is usually the big dividing point on this particular subject. And so I started really wondering, what is it that they're looking for and how can I help them? And to be really honest, one of the things that they were doing were quite awesome, but there were some things that were quite not awesome, and they didn't realize it. And I really didn't know what to do to help them. So I decided to start researching for two big reasons. One is I wanted to find a way to explain what it's like for women on their team and in their churches in a way that would make sense to them, in a way that they could hear it and in a way that was respectful to who they were. That was very important to me. But secondly, I wanted to make sure that I didn't do anything that made these guys feel like the bad guys. Because when I kind of dip my toe into this subject, I feel like that's very much the narrative, is that women are awesome and oppressed, and men are bad and the oppressors. And that is not my personal experience at all. It's not my experience in working with a lot of male leaders, especially pastors all around the country and the world. And I wanted to make sure that I actually helped the good guys, because that's who I believed these folks to be. So I did a whole bunch of research, interviewed a whole bunch of women. We surveyed like over 1,200 women, looked at academia, ministry environments, and the marketplace. And really what the data emerged were these 8 best practices of what leaders in churches can do to help move forward the women in their church. So I want to share with you a couple. Again, I cover a lot of this a lot more of this in the book, quite a bit of it in the podcast that you received. So I wanted to offer some information that maybe isn't covered in those places. So the first one is the best practice of seeking to understand. This is really about challenging our assumptions. We all have biases that are not just about gender, about a lot of things, and they come from the families that we grew up in, the towns that we grew up in, and the churches that we grew up in. We talk a lot about the glass ceiling in church world. We call it the stained glass ceiling, systems and processes that sort of hold women back or other minorities from being able to advance. We talk about the sticky floor, which is things inside women that sort of hold them back, mindsets or insecurities that keep them from putting their name in the hat or really explaining what it is they're able to do. But one thing I wanted to point out today is this whole phenomena that we see happening, especially with really capable professional women known as camouflaging. And this is where we have professional, smart, successful, strong female leaders who walk into environments like many churches where they know their strong leadership is not really fit the gender profile that this community has for them. And so what they do is they tend to shrink or hold back. They don't offer their opinion. They tend to talk a lot more about their kids or what they saw on Facebook rather than the person they fired or the $1 million contract they did this week. When there are guys leading in the church, talking about problems around them, they don't offer the solution that seems really clear to them. They kind of hold back and they might say, I'll pray for you, or you might think about this or read this article, but they would never be forward enough to really give their opinion. And chances are they really have some things to offer. They tend to not want to stand out. But here's the problem. Leaders automatically stand out. And the people who don't stand out are followers. And so when our women leaders sort of shrink down into camouflage or follower status, we not only miss what they have to offer, but as leadership teams, it's really hard to recognize them. And this is starting to have some quite disastrous effects. Professionally trained women are actually one of the top populations leaving the church right now at an alarming rate of 27%. 27% of professional women are deciding church is no longer relevant or helpful to them. There's a whole bunch of stats from Barna that would be interesting to look at that I talk about in the book that talk about the emotional engagement for women, leadership opportunities, seeing role models in their church that they can actually identify with. All of those things are not available to them. So they're turning outside the church. They're starting their own businesses. They're joining Mary Kay or Arbonne or whatever multi-level marketing thing is going on at your church. It's telling them that they can dream big, that they can make a difference in the world, that they have leadership and capacity in them. They have careers. They're going back to grad school. Many are going to seminary because they feel like their church is not the place they can learn how to be a leader. So these women are pulling back and holding back because they don't want to camouflage themselves any longer. I have a friend who is a pastor, and this whole concept of seeking to understand really encouraged him to reach out to one of the women in his church who is a married stay-at-home mom, has 2 little kids, works in the nursery, but he just felt like she's got a confidence about her that's a little different. So he decided to ask her a little bit more about her story and started to learn that before she was married and before she went to college, she was a solo missionary on the mission field. She had gotten a seminary degree at that time and spoke 2 other languages. And this entire time, like 5 years she had been at his church, he just thought she was a stay-at-home mom and one day maybe would be interested in leading something when her kids had grown. Well, guess who now is leading their international missions partnerships? This woman, because she has all this capacity and all this ability, and he was able to kind of look past the camouflage that she was fitting into to really be able to release the potential that God had brought to his church. So that is seeking to understand. The second best practice is number 5 another best practice, number 5, is to be an other. Be an other. This is based on Henry Cloud's book, The Power of the Other, which really talks about how in our leadership transformation and growth journey, it's less about the opportunities we're given and more about the people who are around us. So in the book, I make a claim for 3 key people that are important in any leadership development. Mentors who talk with you about your leadership and your development, sponsors who talk about you, and coaches who challenge you. I want to really hit on this second one sponsors, people who talk about you, because you as leaders have an opportunity to sponsor leadership within your church like nobody else. So think about it. If you are a multi-site church and you are about to launch a campus, you're probably in a leadership team meeting and you're talking about all the different people on the team who could be on the launch team, who could be the campus pastor, who could be in children's, who could lead the ushers, and you're having conversations about people who are not in the room. You are sponsoring people in that conversation. You're advocating for them. You're telling them why you see leadership in them. You're explaining what you've seen done. In our male-populated leadership circles, the problem is when 90% of the people at our leadership tables are men, 90% of the people being sponsored are male. And so the population just gets self-perpetuated with more men being advocated in leadership roles. So I want to really encourage you to sponsor women and other minorities that you see in your church. Get to know their story. Find out about the missionary who's serving in your children's ministry and is underutilized and unnoticed. Advocate for them in meetings. Get to know their story, understand their life dynamics, and be ready to represent them well. When you have a job opening, when you have a volunteer role opening, when you have any sort of conversation, start mentioning them. Put their names in the hat. It's amazing the progress that can be made when leaders like yourselves begin sponsoring people, not just talking with them like a mentor, not just coaching them up in the role that they have, but actually advocating on their behalf. You don't even have to be super close in relationship with them, but this concept of sponsoring, being an other that sponsors, can really move not only the women leaders in your church forward, but it will move your whole church forward in becoming used to seeing leaders, used to talking about female leaders, and used to seeing them and having role models built within your whole congregation. The second thing a church can do when it comes to really advocating for female leaders is to make sure to introduce gift-based serving systems. So this is where, rather than looking for leadership kind of mysteriously, who raises up in the room, we actually offer some classes on helping people know what their actual spiritual gifts are. As the New Testament describes, what am I gifted at? There are no gender roles when it comes to those tests. There are skills and gifts that pop up in all sorts of people, sometimes in very unexpected ways. When we pair those gift-based serving opportunities or serving results with serving opportunities in your church, you start to connect people without letting gender bias get in the way. So if I'm a female and I find out that I have a teaching gift or a leadership gift, I can actually serve in a teaching or leadership role because that's based on my gift, not automatically assume I should be bringing baked goods to the funeral or only serving in children's ministry. Although if I have a shepherding gift and a teaching gift, I might belong in children's ministry, or I might need to be baking baked goods for the funeral. But it lets me know that I'm there because of how God wired me and the gifts that He's called me to do and the anointing that will follow me if I do that. I'm not there because of simply my gender. So being an other is a really critical piece. The third one I want to talk to you about is the best practice number 8, which is the final and probably the most important one, which is taking on our culture. We probably heard the saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and that really is true. And we all know that as leaders, when we try to create an initiative, but we find out the culture has some internal dynamics that aren't really open to it, it can be very, very frustrating. Most people are surprised to learn that my number one population of people who have resisted me leading in the variety of roles that I've had in church and ministry has been other women, particularly older women. I think it's easy for many people to assume that if we're going to start championing women, all the women are going to rally and they're going to be right there with us and be so excited. But if you've had that meeting where you get all the women together and tell them you want to empower them in ministry and they start arguing with one another, you realize it's not as simple as that. And it's surprising, but to me, it makes total sense because the women, especially those who have gone before me, have been in many environments where their big personality or their quick ideas or the vision and future that they can see faster than the rest of the room is usually articulated out as sinfulness or things that she should stop doing or that she should be more quiet or hold back on all of those ideas. And so when you've spent your entire life, and these women are now in their 50s and 60s, being told that leading or teaching or having opinions or hearing from God directly on behalf of other people is actually sinful and wrong, when someone like me shows up and speaks in a room like this, they aren't exactly welcoming. And so the number one population that I really want to encourage you, if you're wanting to make progress in this and move things forward, is to really talk with the women who have been in your church for a while or who have been walking with the Lord for a while, and help them see scripture and your theology around this the way that you do, and help them understand why things are shifting, and help them see how they too have a calling on their life, and that it's important that they walk in it, and that you as a leader are actually going to make a way for them to have that space. The guys need some help too, but I would start with the women, because when women finally get their heads around that God has called them, I think it's amazing to see how fast they step into leadership, how quickly they are to rise in it, and the power and hunger that they bring to ministry, because it's been dormant for so long. So I really want to encourage you to lean into that awkward conversation and wrap your arms around the women who are already there before you make way for those young up and coming leaders. John 17 in the Bible has been one of my favorite chapters for a long time. It has really become super important to me lately. I love it for two reasons in the work that I'm doing right now. First of all, I love it because Jesus is so clear that he finished what God gave him to do. And I think as a leader, I just go, oh, I want that kind of clarity and satisfaction, especially at the end of my life, that I did what God called me to do. But the second one is when I look at Jesus's prayer really on the worst night of his life, before he was crucified. He prays for his disciples, the people who are with him, his leadership team. But then he prays for the disciples who are to come. He prays for us. And he prays that not that we would have great ministries, not that our music would be awesome and our newcomer connection system would be flawless, but he prays that we would be unified. That is actually how people will know that he has come, because we are together. We're locked arm in arm. We're on the same page. We're leading side by side. We've worked through the awkwardness of our differences. We've learned to appreciate one another's gifts. We value one another more than ourselves. That's what actually will stand out in our culture. I mentioned earlier that I actually started writing the book before the Me Too and Church Too movements hit. And I am really amazed, first of all, at the timing that the Lord would have for all of this. But secondly, the awareness and sort of the energy that has come at this time and place in history. And when I talk to my friends, especially business colleagues or friends that aren't churchy people, the rhetoric and the narrative everywhere I go is that the past has been male and that's been bad, but the future is female and that's going to be good. And I just cringe internally when I think of that, because I think of Jesus's prayer. And I think as Christians, we know the future isn't female. The future is together. And the people who can help the future be together are you. It's the leaders. No one else is going to step up and take this place. No one else is going to fight it. No one else is going to shift your culture. You hold the keys to women being able to be released into the kingdom through your local ministry. And so I want to encourage all of us that it's possible. I mostly believe it's possible because I think Jesus is still at the right hand of the Father, and I still think he's praying the same prayer for us, that we would be unified, that we would be together, that we would be one as he and the Father is one, so that the world may know that he sent them and the world may know how much he loves them. The future really is together. Thank you very much.